Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Henry Hemming, and he published a book back in 2017. The title of the book is Agent M, The Lives and Spies of MI5's Maxwell Knight. And this is a topic I was interested in. I did a lot of studying about Knight and some of his acquaintances, people that he knew, Tom Dryberg and Dennis Wheatley, who I've read some of his stuff and really followed Wheatley closely, who was a friend of Maxwell Knight. So this really, this topic and author was something that came to mind. But Henry Hemming has written for The Economist, FT Magazine, Washington Post, and has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor. This is not his first book. He's also written In Search of the English Eccentric in 2009, Misadventure in the Middle East, Travels as a Tramp Artist and Spy, 2010, The Ingenious Mr. Pike, Inventor, Fugitive Spy, 2015, and his most recent book is published under two titles. Here in the States, it would be Our Man in New York, The British Plot to Bring America into the Second World War, and in the UK, it's Agents of Influence, a British campaign, Canadian spy, and the secret plot to bring America into World War II. And that was the 2019-2020. So that's the most recent one. But again, we're going to talk about this book today. Title of it again is Agent M, The Lives and Spies of MI5's Maxwell Knight. So Henry Hemming, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you. Really, really good to be on the show.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard your name and some of your other books, can you talk about your background and what led you to write Agent M?
Yeah, sure. I've so this is it's the second of three books I've written on espionage and intelligence, and you could say I got into it by accident. I was doing books on different themes. I did a travel book. I did two books about English society, and then I was about to pitch to my publisher a new book, a biography of a man called Geoffrey Pike, who was, I thought I was going to be writing a book about an eccentric British inventor, an extraordinary man, someone who even invented the original American and Canadian special forces back in the Second World War. And just before I sent in this pitch to the publisher, there was a press release which said that MI5, the British Security Intelligence Service, was releasing files to show that this same man, Geoffrey Pike, might have been a Soviet agent during the Second World War. And so suddenly I had to rework the pitch, but also crucially, I got into the National Archives in Britain. I began to research more about whether or not he was a Soviet agent, but also that world. And I began to understand that it's, first of all, it's a fascinating world, the world of intelligence and counterintelligence during the Second World War. But also just from a historical point of view, it's a subject which is constantly evolving because more and more material is being released. And so our understanding of exactly what was going on at that time in the 30s and 40s is mutating. And so there's something exciting about that. And the other thing that was exciting was beginning to realize that a lot of these agent reports, which have now been released and now in the public domain, although the names have been anonymized, it was possible by jigsaw identification, if you were really, really diligent and obsessed, as I later became, it was possible to work out the real identities of some of these undercover MI5 agents who were reporting to the security service. And so the activities of MI5 played a small part in this biography of Geoffrey Pike. It became a book called The Ingenious Mr. Pike, which you mentioned, which became briefly a New York Times bestseller in the States. And the book after that is this one. And it came out really as a result of beginning to get a sense of what MI5 was up to during the 30s and 40s. And again, there was this one figure who just stood out as being an extraordinary man, an enigma, and an extremely talented spy master at the same time. And that was Maxwell Knight. So that was how I first became aware of him, how I first was drawn into his world. And it really was only possible to write this book for the first time when I began to research it. So even as little as 5 or 10 years previously, the material simply wasn't there. And you just had to go on speculation, on memoirs that had been written by people who had heard of him and so on. But for the first time, there was enough information out there that you could put together a really detailed, interesting account of exactly what he was up to. But I guess it's not a technical book. I mean, the thing that made me convinced that Agent M could work as a book is understanding him as a character and this enormous conflict within his personal life between essentially the people he was friends with and his country. And this is this conflict which escalates until there is this crisis, if you like, during the early days of the Second World War. And that's when, I mean, to put it simply, he has to decide who he is. He has to decide what matters the most to him. And the moment I sensed that was part of the story, I was hooked. I wanted to write it.
And he's such an interesting character too, just by himself. I mean, you kind of portray him right at the beginning as kind of a aimless, jazz-loving, night-living guy who was very young. Can you talk about kind of his early life and how his character development began and how he got involved in intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a moment where we first encounter him in the book, where he's at a sort of all-time low. He's a part-time teacher. He's teaching games. He wants to teach English, but they don't think he's good enough to do that. He's been kicked out by his family. His family regard him as a black sheep. They see him as a misfit. He's no longer getting a family allowance. He's got a love of jazz, and he's got a love of also animals. He's although he's living in this tiny London flat, he collects animals and looks after them. And this is his rare and unusual gift. He has this extraordinary ability to, if you like, read animals, to look after them, to keep them alive, to sense what they want when they need it. And he's just, he's a natural when it comes to animals. So that's his kind of his hobby. But as a young man, it became almost an obsession, and it was threatening to take over. And so there he is. He's bumbling around. He's got no prospects. He wants to be a novelist. And again, his books, no one wants to buy it. And then he has a chance encounter. He has a chance encounter with someone who says, would you like to do some undercover work, something for your country? And he gets taken on not by MI5 or MI6 or the police, but by a private intelligence agency. And at that time, there were a handful of these quite right-wing private organizations. They were funded by wealthy industrialists who were worried about industrial action. And I think beyond that, they're worried about a left-wing communist revolution, some kind of insurrection. Obviously, this is not too far off. We're in the early 1920s. The memory of 1917 in Russia is not at all distant. And there are a lot of people in Britain who perfectly sensibly felt there was a chance something like that could happen in Britain. And so these people were putting money into intelligence agencies who were trying to find out more about where this unrest was coming from, who the provocateurs might be, and so on.
And
so that's how he gets.
Sorry to interrupt, but that was called the Maxwell organization, right? It was kind of like a Maxwell. Gotcha. Sorry, please continue.
And that was run by a guy called Sir George McGill. And so that's how he gets into it. And it turns out he's really good. He is good at recruiting people, earning their trust, and gathering their intelligence and reporting on this back to his controller. And these are kind of the basic components of being a good intelligence field officer. And it turns out he has them. And I mean, there's a really obvious parallel between his ability to just instinctively read animals and his ability to instinctively read undercover agents, to earn people's trust and to get a sense of how to keep them happy and so on. And so, at last he's found his calling. And from there it begins to, he does really well. He gets taken on by other intelligence agencies. He gets taken on by MI6. He begins to report to the police special branch. And then in 1931, he is not only taken on by MI5, but he's given his own department in MI5, which on the face of it is extraordinary. He's not someone who's kind of carefully worked his way up through the ranks of MI5. He's been taken on, and part of the reason he was taken on and given this prestigious role is that he already had this fantastic network in place. So he had a number of agents who were reporting to him by 1931, and they were embedded inside the Communist Party of Great Britain. They had good intelligence on left-wing organizations. And that is what, at that time, that's what MI5 wanted. So Maxwell Knight had this ready-made organization, and that's where his career begins.
Right. So he was kind of just a free living guy who was financed by Macgill, and he actually became kind of part of what was the British fascisti, I think it was, you called it in the book,
exactly.
which was kind of, it wasn't as a negative thing back then to be a fascist as it is kind of now, I would say. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And every time I say it, every time I write that in the book, it just doesn't sort of read right. The moment any of us hear the word fascist, even if it's got the letter I on the end, fascisti, we immediately have a pretty clear and just non-moving definition of what that could mean. But back in the 1920s, to be a British fascisti was not the same as what it meant to be a British fascist in the 1930s. So it was, it was a more moderate organization. It wasn't as overtly anti-Semitic. It wasn't as obsessed with uniform and discipline and authoritarianism. But let's not kid ourselves. It was still right-wing. It still had very traditional views on how things could be. There's one quote that I put in the book. They describe it as conservatism with knobs on. It's just a kind of exaggerated version of something we're all fairly familiar with.
But that's how he started his infiltration. He was infiltrating too. So his network starts there. William Joyce, some of these other characters.
So he's told his job is to go and infiltrate this right-wing group, the British fascisti. But there's no doubt I wouldn't say he goes native, but he forms friendships within that group, which are real. He gets on well with some of these key individuals, and they form friendships. This guy William Joyce, who becomes a huge part of his life, he's the man that Knight is particularly interested in. And William Joyce actually pretty much steals Maxwell Knight's first girlfriend. So they've got this. There's also kind of a personal dynamic there, and I mean, to put it really simply, to someone who doesn't know anything about William Joyce represents many of the things that Maxwell Knight wishes he had, and vice versa. So Maxwell Knight, I suppose what William Joyce has that Knight does not, he is a stronger character. He is more impulsive. He's more successful with women than Maxwell Knight is. And at the same time, Joyce admires things about Maxwell Knight, his ability to write, his ability to read agents and so on. So they've got this fascinating sort of almost love-hate relationship where they both envy and admire things in each other, and they become friends. And this is a friendship that will later come to haunt Maxwell Knight.
Right. So Joyce goes on, but I think he's an important figure because it's somebody he keeps interrelating with as the kind of fascist movement grows. And so Knight kind of comes out and becomes established, right, in 31. Can you explain how he kind of created his kind of stable of assets and agents, and why did he even decide that he would go by Agent M?
Yeah, he set up an organization within MI5, or an agency within MI5 called M Section. And in answer to your question, why did he go for that? I think there's a bit of vanity. I think there was a little bit also of, he'd read a lot of spy fiction. This is a man who's a brilliant spy master, but someone who is not at all immune to the romance of espionage. And there's a lovely line from someone who was run by Maxwell Knight, who noticed that Maxwell Knight loved to meet this particular agent in either in the back row of theaters or in the in hotel lobbies in kind of remote suburban, quite grubby hotels. And he once asked Maxwell Knight, why do we keep meeting these places? There are so many other places we could meet. And he said, well, that's what they do in spy novels. And so, there was a part of him that enjoyed just slightly playing this role. And you don't need to read much spy fiction to know that a lot of fictional spy masters will go by a letter. It could be M, it could be R, there's a real spy master, the head of MI6, who went by the letter C, but plenty of fictional ones that went by other letters of the alphabet. So he decided he'd become this figure M, and all his agents would be designated as M1, M2, M3, or MA, MB, MC. And it was a part of his legend, part of his the mystique he wanted to create. And so his brief in 1931 was pretty simple: keep your existing organization going, but also take on more agents. And they want to find out much more about what's going on inside the Communist Party of Britain. So his one of his big innovations is, and it sounds so obvious to us today, but one of his big innovations was to start trying to recruit female secretaries. And knowing that we're still in a world where being a good typist is an essential function, and we're also still in a world where the heads of even left-wing political groups would have a devoted secretary who'd be there in the room or in the room next door, hearing a lot of what's going on, seeing who's coming in, who's coming out. And at the time in MI5, the idea of taking on a woman as an MI5 agent was strange, was weird. A lot of MI5 officers were conservative, and they had an basically fairly misogynistic take on what a woman was capable of, and felt it was just a mistake to take on any women, full stop. And Maxwell Knight was different. He thought that women, I can't remember his exact quote, but he thought women often made better undercover agents than men. And I think his main thinking here was that they had less of a need, as he put it, to show off and to try and impress other people with what they were doing, so they were more trustworthy. And so he began to recruit a number of female agents, and the one that I was really taken by when I was researching all this was the amazing Olga, who had grown up in Birmingham, and she moved to London to become an undercover agent for MI5, and she did amazingly. I want to always keep some of my powder dry for the book, but she got about as far into the Communist Party as it was possible to have got.
Right, as a secretary. So she observed, and he was telling her, just be patient, patient, and it ended up working out, right?
It ended up working out. At the same time, it took an enormous toll. She had a breakdown, and it's kind of it's sort of impressive, but also maybe questionable in terms of the ethics of it, that after this breakdown, he talked to her and she said she wanted to go back into the field, and he agreed. And you could say that perhaps that was a mistake, but anyway, she did. And this led to one of the great espionage triumphs in the 1930s for MI5, where they uncovered a Soviet ring within London that was capturing, photographing, and exporting extremely valuable military secrets. And Maxwell Knight had an agent who was on the inside of this operation, who was actually in the room as some of the photographs were being taken.
Yeah, so I mean, they had success. I mean, so they were also curious or concerned about communism, but also about Mosley and the new reformed fascists, the British Union of fascists too, right? And their influence as Hitler and Mussolini kind of rose. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this is very much in lockstep with what's going on politically. That in general is sort of now established truth for most historians. The British took too long to understand the threat of fascism across Europe. And for too long, they saw it as something essentially benign and not to worry about. And Maxwell Knight was guilty of this as well. And he was obsessed with, as MI5 was, he was obsessed with getting inside the communist movement. He had friends inside the fascist movement. He didn't see them as a threat. So it was only really late in the day, so we're talking kind of 36, 37, 1936, 1937, that he begins to really apply himself to getting agents into the British fascist underground. And one of the people who he briefly takes on is this character, William Joyce, but he recruits a number of others. And what he even does, which I find amazing, is he got some of the agents he had inside communist parties. He got them out and said, okay, change of plan. You now need to go and reinvent yourself as a fascist, which, I mean, for any agent, that is extraordinary, that kind of shift. And I think this is one of the things that I was struck by when researching Agent M is just the skill required as an agent to do that, and it's one which is not necessarily celebrated. A lot of these people, their identities remained a secret. They took their secrets to the grave, and at the same time, they were extraordinarily talented in being able to do what they did. So yeah, he eventually gets agents inside the British fascist movement.
And that's one of the interesting things about the book is these interesting agents that he had, how the peculiar characters and
Yeah.
how they did it. And a lot of you said that a lot of them did it just because it was for their moral outlook. They believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't very well paid, right?
Yeah, no, they were. I think it's fair to say they were terribly paid, and that was partly because MI5 was not rolling in cash. Also because Maxwell Knight did not want. He wanted people who were motivated by a sense of service, by patriotism, and also by a fear of communism and a fear of the Soviet Union. He was wary of anyone who was getting paid too much because he thought they were just doing it for the wrong reasons. And yeah, a lot of these people they gave a lot, and it was there was something quite moving about finding out about what happened to them after they finished their undercover careers. And a lot of them suffered later on in life. A lot of them became alcoholics or became obese or suffered from stress-related diseases or conditions. And yeah, I mean, obviously, correlation, not causation, perhaps, but there's a clear trend in terms of what happened to a lot of these men and women.
Right. So they went through a lot of stress. I mean, it was interesting. And like he was activating, I think it was Eric Roberts or something of like he got activated. He's a bank teller by day, spy by night. He said he had to change into his fascist outfit in bathrooms and stuff. Like really interesting vignettes and stories about these guys. And it turns out a lot of their investigations netted important information because the communists and the fascists were a real threat and were internationally connected, right?
Absolutely, they were, and it provided huge amount of information. I think what it also did was allowed the British government at that time to get a sense of just a clearer sense of how bad the threat was. In some cases, there's as much value in proving that there is a limited threat. So the threat from, let's say, Soviet infiltration at that time in the kind of early 30s was not huge, and there's a value in finding that out. But it really, a lot of this intelligence really came into its own in the early days of the Second World War, when the British government was obviously preparing for a German invasion, was trying to work out what to do. And Maxwell Knight was pretty decisive in terms of arguing to Churchill that the fascists should be locked up, that they did pose a threat. And this, to me, this is a huge moment, because a lot of these people that he's saying needed to be locked up without trial were former friends of his, were people he knew inside out, were people whose wives and children he knew. And of him to say that, I think, took moral courage, and it played. I mean, I think beyond that, this is not an intentional effect, but something about that, this moment of internment, I think that changed for a lot of people in Britain their understanding of what was going on. In other words, it made a lot of people in Britain realize this is serious. This is we really are at war. This is not a phony war, and I think it changed a lot of attitudes.
And so, I mean, there was really that moment, like, are we going to intern this or do this or not? Do you think that was the right decision looking back, or what's the kind of impression about this, pretty unique approach to the problem?
Yeah, it's one of these things where if you look back on it knowing everything we know, it was the wrong decision. If you look back at the decision knowing everything that they knew, it was the right decision. So based on the information they had, I think it was the right decision. But based on what we now know of the actual threat, it was not.
It wasn't. And there were other kind of things that he was involved in. So many there's spy and counter spy. It really was this kind of espionage work. Can you define espionage in the book? Can you let the listener know what espionage means? And some of the Soviet infiltrators were really fascinating, some of those stories.
Yeah, I mean, espionage is simply trying to gather intelligence. But I suppose what Maxwell Knight was trying to do was counterintelligence, counterespionage, which is trying to stop other people gathering intelligence. And that's what his agents were really dedicated to. And I shouldn't get too starry-eyed here. He was up against an extremely sophisticated Soviet espionage operation. And as we all know, Cambridge 5 and so on, there were a large number of Soviet agents who went undetected for a long time. And Maxwell Knight's operation was, in theory, it was meant to stop all of that. And it was not up to that task. It gathered a huge amount of intelligence. It stopped a certain amount of espionage, but by no means was it supremely triumphant. And for some reason, I love the story of him encountering Anthony Blunt. So Anthony Blunt was a Soviet agent. He was part of the Cambridge 5, and he'd been taken on by MI5. He was inside MI5, and he decided he wanted to get inside Maxwell Knight's office, and so he tried to join. But Maxwell Knight, and it's just some evidence of this instinct he had, was just convinced that there was something up with Anthony Blunt. He was convinced. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew there was something. And he began to think that Anthony Blunt might be a Nazi agent. He didn't know, he had no idea which side he was on, but he could tell he was a man who had more secrets than most. And so he refused to let Blunt into his office. But one of the people who did get into Maxwell Knight's office later on was John le Carre, who spent 4 years working under Maxwell Knight and was taken by him, and even illustrated some of Maxwell Knight's animal books. I should have mentioned Maxwell Knight then reinvents himself after the Second World War as this nature-loving TV personality, this kind of David Attenborough figure. And he's on the radio, he's on TV, he's telling children and people about how to look after pets, or how to spot birds in the undergrowth and so on. And he becomes this sort of lovable figure that millions of British people are familiar with, and not a single one of them knows. Well, almost none of them know about
what he's doing for the last 2 decades, right?
Yeah. And what was amazing is he's doing the two things, they overlap. So he's still a serving senior MI5 officer, while also popping out of the office to do broadcasts about pet otters.
Right. And he had baboons in his apartment. You were talking about just the mix of, really some pretty creatures who probably should be in zoos. I don't know how he got away with that.
I know. I don't think you wouldn't be able to get away with it now. Yeah. He's, but yeah, he had all sorts. He had baboons. He had a small bear at one point, and also there's a small kind of, I mentioned the word vanity before. There's a little bit of exhibitionism in that. He loved to be able to say, I've got the most extraordinary menagerie. I've got a baboon and a bear and a parrot, as opposed to just being obsessed with one animal. He liked to put on a show. And, as I also say in the book, it's a strange thing for an exhibitionist to choose to become a spy master.
Yeah, he's a very complex person.
Absolutely.
And 27 books. His output is really incredible, to think that he was doing all this at the same time while writing books.
And talking about books, there's amazing to see how many of his reporting agents would go on to write their own books, usually novels. And this is a real theme. He'd look for people who are not only good at keeping their cool, good at telling lies and keeping up a cover, but also people who could write decent reports, who understood what was salient information and what was not. And that was a crucial part of what it took to be an undercover agent. And there's they put out an amazing variety of books, the different people working for M Section, including John le Carre.
There you go. John le Carre. David Cornwell's his real name, and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which they just kind of remade, has a character based upon Knight, right?
Yeah, well, no, that's a Perfect Spy.
Perfect Spy, sorry.
Perfect Spy has got Jack Brotherhood. Gotcha. And Jack Brotherhood is basically Maxwell Knight, in every regard. And that was really helpful when researching the book, being able to get into that. And Le Carre is such a good portraitist.
Le Carre is like one of the greats, right? One of the great post-war spy writers.
Yeah, and there was an amazing moment just in terms of just how good Le Carre is. He wrote a piece shortly before he died, and he referred to Maxwell Knight, and he referred also to my book on him briefly. But he then, I can't remember the exact wording, but he then summed up Maxwell Knight in a sentence. And I remember thinking, I've written a book 350 pages long, but there's no sentence which encapsulates the man as well as that one line. And yeah, I'm in awe of the man. He's so he understood Maxwell Knight particularly well.
And he had friends too. I mean, he was friends with Dennis Wheatley, somebody I've researched, so somebody who's a very influential writer with incredible output too. I mean, their relationship is very curious because that's kind of, they're both interested in spy writing. Like I think it was Wheatley's Salas series, who's a spy that influenced Ian Fleming. So you can trace connection between Maxwell Knight to Wheatley to Fleming. It's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. And Maxwell Knight shared an interest in the occult. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I don't know enough about it. It's not a big part of the book because I don't have kind of, chapter and verse. But he and Wheatley were both intrigued by the occult. So both, fascinated by Aleister Crowley. Fascinated is the wrong word. They wanted to know more about him, I think is a better way of putting it.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think they were interested in drawing information from him. Wheatley, definitely, for sure. There's a signed copy. I have it in Children of the Beast. Signed copy of Aleister Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice, specifically signed to Dennis Wheatley. So he was an influence on Wheatley, at least as a character, as a bad character. But there's stories about that. I mentioned Joan Miller. Joan Miller was somebody associate to Knight, but you didn't really find her very credible, right?
I didn't. And the sad thing is that it's one of these things where she wrote her memoir pretty certain that all the official papers would never come out. And I think what sort of, I mean, you can see very clearly just from all the official reports that have come out that she took the credit for a lot of stuff that was done by other people. She wrote the memoir when she needed money, and she also, she essentially, because she was rejected by Maxwell Knight, she put out the line that anyone who rejects me essentially has to be gay. And so she promoted the line that Maxwell Knight was secretly gay. And this stuck because there's no one really to kind of contradict that. And yeah, Maxwell Knight's sexuality is in itself an interesting subject. I think, based on everything we know, because he had 3 marriages during his life. He had a number of what have been described as affairs, all with women. And I think he was probably heterosexual. And I think he had problems performing, for want of a better word. And it said that none of his marriages were consummated, which, but, who are we to know? It's one of these things we'll never actually kind of know.
But he's always with women, so you always he's having relationships with women. They may not be, like you said, consummated. It was interesting in your book too, because he listed out all of his agents, M1, M2, not known to the public, but you were able to decipher and kind of uncover some of those names, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was I found that thrilling, as anyone would. It was just detective work and going to all sorts of different archives, trying to fill in the gaps that have been left in the official record. And it's you could say that some of these people's identities need to remain a secret forever, but I think it's actually more important to celebrate what they did. And all of the people who I was able to identify have been long dead. And it's only when you know who an agent is that you understand where they've come from and also what happens to them afterwards. And so suddenly it becomes this much richer portrait of the lives of all these different men and women who sacrificed so much. I mean, everyone from there's a woman who used to do cookery demonstrations outside supermarkets where she was selling a certain type of flour. So this great kind of performer who became one of Maxwell Knight's undercover agents. And apparently within her family, she, towards the end of her life, started saying, by the way, I used to work for MI5. And everyone just said, You've lost the plot. You've gone mad. And there's something tragic about this. Only much later were they able to find out, like, actually, this is she really was. She was telling the truth. And there were several instances where I was able to confirm to the children or the grandchildren their suspicions or their feelings that perhaps Granny or Mum or Dad might have been an MI5 agent. I was able to confirm that yes, they were, and this is what they did.
Wow, that's amazing.
And that was thrilling.
They couldn't even tell their own kids. I think the Official Secrecies Act is really intense, right, over there. I mean, I don't know what they're bound by, but I remember Fleming talking about, like, I can't talk about anything I did in World War II. Yeah. And so a lot of these people really super secrets. And that was a theme in your book. That was one of the central themes of the book is, can you keep your mouth shut, right?
Absolutely. And I think once you get into the habit of it, it's pretty easy to keep it going to an extent. I shouldn't say pretty easy, but it's possible to keep it going. What's interesting is that Maxwell Knight would always, I wouldn't say encourage, but he'd always allow agents to tell their other half, so their husband or their wife, and that certainly made it easier to keep that secret. I think the pressure of keeping it, even from the person you're sharing a bed with, would be too much, and so he understood that, and that's why he was able to keep some of his agents going for 20 years, which is almost unheard of in the world of intelligence.
It really is incredible. I think that he had the sensibility. I think it comes through in your book that he was much more empathetic towards his agents and understood them and tried to help them through. I think that was maybe set him aside from somebody else who maybe more. I think the other guy you talked about was Kern or Kell or something, maybe a little less.
Yeah. No, certainly. Some of the other guys they like to keep their distance more. And slightly sort of looked down upon and sneered at undercover agents, saw them as kind of expendable. And Maxwell Knight was different.
Yeah, really fascinating book. Loved reading the book. Great interview, great discussion. Where's the best place for people to get Agent M?
You know what? All good bookshops. I believe it's nowhere in particular I can think of. I mean, I think, I'm sure Amazon is probably the easiest place for a lot of people, but it's in most well-known bookshops.
And your website is your full name, henryhemming.com, correct?
Exactly.
And I will put that in the show notes. So it's his full name, HenryHemming.com. And again, the title of the book is Agent M, The Lives and Spies of MI5's Maxwell Knight, and published in 2017. So Henry, thank you so much for the discussion. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Really good to talk.
All right, great. Take care. Stay there.
Thanks.